Okay. Hi there, I'm Beavis, I'm with AMCI, and I get the privilege of interrogating this particular group. We're going to talk here a little bit, really an extension of what you just heard from Alison about what is going on in terms of understanding consumers and what automakers are doing in this particular area. So, a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, I'll get these gentlemen to introduce themselves in a moment, but if you've got questions, feel free to ask them during the presentation so that we don't lose the train of thought here. I find that is a little bit more interactive. And then the other thing is I've got a marker here that if I see any of you looking into your bloody phones or going to sleep, I'm going to throw it at you. So, good. I'll just make sure. So, with that, why don't we hand over to Steve here to introduce each of yourselves.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Steve Ambeau, Head of Brand Communications for Mini.
Erich Marx, Director of Marketing for Nissan, and I'd just like to say I agree 100% with everything Alison just said. She's brilliant.
Erich has very strong survival instincts.
Hi, I'm Eric Thomas. I am responsible for experiential marketing in the US for Hyundai Motor America.
So we've got some different brands here. We've certainly got Mini, which is an iconic brand. We've got Nissan, who's enormous, and we've got Hyundai, who wants to eat Nissan's lunch. So I think we're in a pretty good place here for a good discussion. So I'm going to throw it open here, and I'll probably start off with Steve, is how in the last 3 to 5 years have consumers changed, and how are you changing how you communicate and relate to them, and where do you see it going? Because the problem with research is like driving down the road at 80 mile an hour and looking in the rear vision mirror. So how do you sort of stay ahead of it? So yeah, there's a challenge. Off you go.
Geez, how long do we have? That's a loaded question.
4:15, we're finishing whether you're finished or not.
And we stand between everybody and drinks. That's never easy to do. I think generally, we've taken a step back, I would say, in trying to, like everything should, start with the customer. I mean, Alison talked a fair bit about it. But really, as marketers, I often think we get classified into buckets. We have customers, we have prospects, and we want to conquest. And we go out and we look at how we do that. And if we look at Mini as an example, as a niche brand, we have drivers that are 22 years old, and we have drivers that are 74 years old, and everything in between. So it's really, generally we would look at that and say, well, they're all our customers, therefore they're all alike. And the reality is that's not the same, and it's probably not the same for any of us. So how do you start to cluster those people and understand them? You can't cluster them too much because also, as Alison mentioned, we have limited reach, ability in terms of production dollars, media dollars to go out and reach these people. But ideally, it's what's that common thread amongst the people and the demographic and the customer set that we're talking to. And then how have they changed? I think just that behavioral patterns have changed in terms of that funnel that we all love to talk about in the automotive market. I like to kill the funnel and say the funnel is dead. The funnel is no more linear, I think we would say. There is a funnel somewhere. But I think that funnel just changes. I can go from creating awareness to generating a lead form and then still wait 3 months before I actually go into a dealership. And then I can go back and take some very high-level actions or behavioral actions on your website. I mean, it's just all over the map, and there is no one the same. So again, it goes back to the dynamic content and how we are relevant. And in Mini and BMW Group, we just simply call it the relevancy theory. I need to deliver a relevant content to the relevant audience at the relevant time, on the relevant platform, on the relevant device. We can go all day with this. You can see how it can make sense with relevancy. So I think those are some things how we're addressing it, but I really think taking 5,000 steps back and really starting to look at the customer again. We lose sight of the number one. We all talk about customer centricity, and big buzzword obviously today in marketing. But again, really taking a holistic look at the customer. Who are they? And then, of course, how do you reach them? Reaching them, and then who don't you want to talk to is equally as important in media-type budgets today as it has been ever. So again, fencing and how I don't talk to certain people that frankly may buy our car regardless if we talk to them or not, and spare those impressions or spare those valuable dollars.
One area that I do want to touch on is that, we, as marketers, we try and quite rationalise everything to some great extent. But the reality is that most purchases, all purchases really are highly emotional, and then we post-rationalise. And so I'm interested in, with a brand like Mini, how you create this emotional connection with you've got to be relevant, but how do you create a really meaningful emotional connection with your prospects and your customers?
That's suggesting that we do that. We certainly try to do that. I mean, full transparency, I think Mini's lost some of its way over the last 5 years in doing so. And I think we're not the only brand to do so. I think maybe it's a broader statement, but I feel like brands in general tier 1 brands have become very transactional. We live in this transactional world, this frictionless commerce society, this digital commerce society, this one-click society. And so as brands, we want to quickly find these attribution models and these models to get that next click, that next engagement, to get them closer to the end goal, which is buying something, buying a car in this case. I think in doing so, that's great, but we optimize towards all the transactions. And that becomes a problem, and I think brands, classic brands, lose their way if we only focus on getting that next engagement, that next click, that next goal before, or that next target to get to the end goal. And in doing so, we lose that emotional connection with the audience.
Yeah, you have to date before you get married.
I'd like to think so. Maybe go on a vacation, introduce yourself to the parents, and buy a pet or something.
Eric, your thoughts on how consumers have changed and how you're changing and connecting with them, and you don't have to say everything that Alison said.
At the risk of being a little redundant, that was a beautiful speech there, and I agree with so much of that. I would just say the bar's been raised. The consumer's in control more than ever. Every year it seems like the choices they have multiply. The way that we reach them, the way we find them, and the way we engage them has to match the growth and has to match the consumer's needs. Because again, they are in control. As Alison said, we have to engage with them in less than 8 seconds. We have to find different ways to speak to them in a way that's compelling and engaging, whether that's 6-second, 50-second, or 30-second piece of content. We have to think about where they are, not only in life stage, but also in where they are in terms of a purchase stage. Are they in the future market, near market, or are they in market? And it's a different message. For that same consumer, the message might change them, 1 year versus the next year. Same consumer, but a different stage, different life stage, different consumer stage. And so, as I say, the consumer is more in control than they've ever been. We need to adapt. We need to find and engage them in a way that's compelling to them.
So Eric, this sort of gets to your point. You're the experiential guy, yes. And so these guys are busy in the ether up there, and then finally someone comes down to your world. So how are you changing the way you connect in terms of experiential? And while you're talking that, talk a little bit about where auto shows and general events beyond just ride and drives work for you.
That's a lot. What I would say is what they've said is we're not unique. I think we're all experiencing that, and I think things are in the consumer's hands. I think if anything, what we know is that they're spending 17 hours doing research on the car. They've probably narrowed it down to 1 or 2. They may not have even stepped out of a brand that they normally look at. So then they go to maybe 1.5 dealerships. So it's ever more difficult to connect with consumers and to really give them that brand impression. I use that to my advantage inside because I say, well, the only way then, if the consumer doesn't want to go to a dealer, is to give them an experiential experience, redundancy, that really is, one, brand defining, but also special, unique, something that they remember, and something that gets them in the car. And I think that there's tremendous opportunity in most groups, most brands, experiential divisions for that reason. Because again, if I'm not going to go into anything other than Mini dealership or Nissan dealership or Hyundai dealership to look, then how do you convert? Your digital content is screaming along with everyone else's, and so how do you get that thing that's out there that matters? How do you get them to touch, see, feel, and smell? And that's experiential. And it's fun. Then the next thing is, well, how do you get enough dollars to really tackle those segments that were talked about earlier, right? So we're all seeing those segments. For us, we're sort of limited to focus really generally on the one car that we're launching rather than sort of sustaining that message through the life cycle, right? Wouldn't it be lovely if we had the right amount of money for each individual model the whole way through? So we're looking, and that just isn't reality, but we're looking constantly at those things that we can do that, sends that message. I'm trying to figure out how I can phrase this. So we announced this week, I think I'm free to say that we announced that we're going to be building a truck out of our plant in Alabama. So therefore we have a truck coming. So where's the place that we want to be we haven't been, that's going to connect and get people to think about our brand differently, get them to think that this truck is right. So we're already putting those thoughts in our mind. And getting someone who is a truck buyer that hadn't considered a brand to stop and think, I have to go and do that search, or better yet, come to their experiential endeavor to really touch and feel that car. So that's the fun part. Auto shows, I would argue, are still tremendously of value. I think that we're seeing some decline in attendance, and that's got a lot of folks freaked out. But at the end of the day, when you look at the 70-plus shows that are out there, attendance is still anywhere, I would say 15 million plus, right? If you go by the independent research that's done to study the attendance. So do you turn your back on that market where there's where there's people that want to pay to come in and hear your message and touch your car? No, they're still tremendously of value. I think one of the things that I've been working to bring as a challenge in our team, and actually the collective with other brand auto show managers to the show managers themselves, is how are you embracing the digital age? So why is it in the digital age you still can't tell me who was there? Why is it in the digital age you can't tell me who was there, who bought what when they did? Because at least until CCPA takes full effect and we know kind of the limitations on reach, there was a way to know who came to the show because you did electronic ticket sales. You held on to that information. Then there's a way to go back. If you're saying, if you want to stay relevant, hey, this is your investment in the show last year. You guys look like what you did, and that's great. Your competitor looked like this. They probably put in twice as much, and as a result, here's the returns. We all, as brands, want to work together because, gosh, people, again, are going to come in and pay money to come and hear our message, right? So we want them to come. And so I think if we're thinking about the future of what auto shows do, it's us working together to ensure that this channel stays open and stays relevant, and that the show managers embrace sort of what we already have.
Thanks. So just thinking about, we've talked a lot about digital, and I just talked about experiential. There's been a lot of discussion, JD Power and others have talked about this for some years, about the whole online to offline world. What are you doing to try and, we obviously want to become frictionless, but how are you managing what is going on in the digital space and then transitioning it into the physical space? The reason I ask this is there was a statistic that we cited in another presentation recently that said that 80% of people, when they're getting close to purchase, will go to the dealer's website and look at inventory. But when that person actually goes through the door of the dealership, 90% of them are completely unknown to the dealer. So how are you, as a brand it's a much more difficult problem, but how are you managing the online to offline world to make sure that you take this consumer on some journey that you can at least have some role in managing or at least curating for them?
I think the first thing we need to do as a collective audience is define online and offline, or what digital is, because I think we think digital, we think online. Does that mean www. Or what does that exactly mean? So if everyone pictures that big screen in your living room that we call the television, is that a television, or is that just a big screen in your living room that can produce the same content that the laptop or the iPad or the iPhone, Apple, you're welcome, smartphone, can produce in your household? So we know it can produce the same content. Again, I just questioned, so using ACR, automatic content recognition, that's a way to contact or complete the journey, you could say, from that one screen into a multi-device conversation into your household. There's a lot of technologies out there that can allow you to try to bring that journey to be a little bit more sequential. So that's one thing, I think, with those technologies, but I think it's clearly that offline and online world is way more blurred than it's ever been. And even just looking at the experiential side from Eric, I mean, if it's biometrics like Allison talked about, or just using some other heat monitoring to see what the dwell time is around a car at a showroom. You know, all of this technology is fantastic. It is digital technology. How we find audiences, that's digital. It's not online versus offline, but it is definitely a digital world in which we play.
There's no doubt. Defining the customer journey is paramount. How do we connect Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3? How do we partner with dealers, again, to help define what happens as a customer goes through the journey from a Tier 1 message to a Tier 2 in-market message to actually showing up at the dealership. Partnering with the dealers and working with them to better understand what the purchase considerations are on-site, offline, at the dealership. That's something that we're exploring at a deeper level than we ever have before.
So how do you really connect with your customers? You know, we had this discussion earlier, you know, about, you know, this emotional connection, you know, rational messages. No one buys a car because it has 7 or 8 features. They buy it for a myriad of other things that surround those 7 or 8 features. So how, within your organisations, given that we all acknowledge that the purchase funnel doesn't exist as it's been constructed, how do you create competitive sets, and how do you create personas, and what sort of data are you using to help create the right messages to get that emotional connection? It's a big question. It can go in a million different directions, but what I'm trying to get to here is we have, Alison made a comment, you know, data in the service of creativity. We're swimming in data. I worked at Nielsen. In the 7 years I worked there, I never had a client ask me for more data, ever. All what they were asking for is some bloody information that you could do something with. So I assume you're going through that as well, but how are you creating your messaging to make sure that you are getting this emotional connection? And then if you are doing what I'm suggesting you're doing, how do you know it's working? Because the problem that every car company has, and was touched on earlier, is we're so bloody transactional. And, you know, the average car is 11.4 year, ownership is 11.4 years. You've got people in 2 and 3 year leases, but you've got this incredible purchase journey, right? The transaction is this bit at the end. How the hell do how do you build this relationship that gets you the chance to have the transaction? And I'll throw it to any of you. And by the way, I'm asking the question because I don't have the bloody answer either, so off you go.
Again, not to echo everything that Allison said, but she's absolutely right. There's multiple audiences, and one message does not fit each audience. And we are going model by model and defining up to 4 different audience segments with a unique, discrete message and piece of content for each. And we believe we're on the right track in terms of defining discrete messages for each of these audiences, and then measuring both in the pre-production period as well as in market.
How are you identifying the audiences, though? So we had the nice little buckets of the 4 that Alison showed, but how did you arrive at what was the right thing to say to those people to connect with them?
Honestly, we have a team of data scientists. We have a few people on the client side and then at the agency side, and we work in depth with them at a level that I probably won't be able to do justice to here. But again, a level of data, a level of research into who is buying these vehicles, and it's model by model that we have never explored before. Just in this past year, we have started to dive very deep into it. And as I say, then we test to make sure that the messages we're sending and building for these audiences are compelling. A/B tests in the digital space, optimizing all along, trying to find the right balance between our Nissan Intelligent Mobility technology message with an engaging message that hits them emotionally, and constantly trying to optimize these audiences and the messages we're sending them to make sure that we're achieving what you talk about.
It's interesting. You're one of the few brands at the moment that are really being overt in going after, creating a technology message, and you're trying to keep it simple. How relevant is the technology message to these consumers, or are you really trying to introduce technology as something they should be thinking about?
Well, I'll just say, quite frankly, when we first introduced Nissan Intelligent Mobility last year, we, by all accounts, probably over-pivoted towards a tech for tech's sake message. We were so excited about this new direction and the technology that was coming in cars, not just our most expensive trims, but vehicles all the way down, to a very accessible price level and customer, that we probably skewed a little too far on the technology message. What we've learned through the research, through neuroscience, and again, pre-production testing, in-market testing, is that without an emotional hook to tell the consumer benefit of the technology, we were missing out. We were suboptimal. We were not as compelling in the marketplace. And so we've righted the ship, trying to find that balance. And again, working very closely with market intelligence to make sure that we retain that balance, audience by audience, within each model, whether it's a 15-second piece of content or the full 30-second or long form. Constantly optimizing.
And so how are you dealing with the dealers? How are the dealers reacting to this? Because this isn't their taste.
Except they love I would say, the course correction. Mm-hmm. The course correction where we started to add a little bit of humanity in. You saw some spots that Allison just showed where we show kind of the metaphor, the human metaphor, where the friend cuts the guy off on the dance floor, and then we go to a vehicle with blind spot warning. They actually really like and are very much a fan of where we're course correcting to in terms of balancing a tech message, blind spot warning, with a human moment that is meaningful to them. As Allison said, we had one with families, we had one with young drivers and teens and boomers.
Yeah, I don't know that my wife would have saved me walking into the fire.
So long and short is the dealers are actually very, very pleased with the current direction.
Because it is a more emotional way to, and a more, I think, potentially more relevant way of getting technology across. Has it manifested itself in your work, Eric, too?
Well, I would just say for us, not completely unsimilar. I mean, there's a ton of data, and certainly if we marketed to all the groups that they are identified, again, we would probably triple our budget, right? So that's not the reality. The reality is it exposes a lot of great opportunities, and then you sort of pick and target those groups where we've already identified who our brand is, and we stay true to those points of appeal, both technology but also the emotional, and identify those that we think that will appeal to the most, right? So we're not taking an emotional message where we're not authentically there. We're speaking to those people in a way that we're complementing, or we're for lack of a better way to say it again, authentically in that space with a message that we know will resonate, and that again is based on research. I just want to go back really quickly to something you asked earlier about kind of the dealerships and the transition and technology and what's happening. I think either way, all of this, our dealers like any time that the vehicle is featured, the technology is featured generally. Of course, they like stuff to be funny and kitsch and cute. They like the idea of winning, but they really want to know that it's going to drive them into the dealer. And there's a belief that certainly anything about the car is going to certainly do so. So it's up to us to sort of find that balance. In terms of how consumers are doing that, that message will vary across the different channels. And at the end of the day, you just want to know, can they respond? The question is about digital. What's happening and how are they doing it? And so we had Joe St. John come in and talk to our dealers late last month, I guess it was, and we were, one of the best questions he asked them, how many of you have a digital sales department? And he waited, and like, we have a digital sales team or a digital sales manager. And at the end of the day, the point was, in this day and age, if you only have a digital team responding to people engaging with you electronically or by some mobile device or online, then you're missing the point. This is how the business has transitioned, so everybody should be able to respond to however the consumer wants to be responded to, wherever they identify themselves to be in the funnel. You should just be prepared, right? And I say the funnel just because it's a level set, if you will. But anyway.
I'll just mention go back to the customer conversation and how do you start building out those customers, because I find it interesting, if nothing else, that a brand like Mini versus Nissan, we both have 4 customer clusters, yet compare the volumes, and I think you get where I'm going with that. So, I mean, how do we build these clusters of audiences? And I think as marketers, we generally start with who's buying our car right now. And so if you build those out, we all know the model or the lookalike model of building these customers out. Flatter me with a quick story here, but there's a there's a bias out there that's called a survival bias, and it was based on World War II survival bias, and the engineers would look at the airplanes coming back from World War II, and the head engineer would ask the other team of engineers, okay, where do we need to add more armor to our airplanes? And they'd look to see where the bullet holes are. And they said, no, that's not at all where we need to add armor. So these are the planes that are making it back. We need to go find the planes that aren't making it back and look where the bullet holes are there. It's the same if you look at a niche brand like ours, and I think it's the same on any brands. If we start with building out the people that are buying our customers and we ignore the people that are not buying our customers, that's the survival bias, and where we look at how we build out these audience clusters. And again, without data in this digital space that we live in, frankly, we never would have been able to look at this populace as a mad index and see how does our current customer over-index, under-index, and looking at the broader populace or population set. So I think that's something how we're trying to get more educated, again, on not who's buying our car necessarily, but who isn't buying our car.
Who you're missing. Well, you know, we talked about earlier about loyalty rates. You know, you've got 53, 54% loyalty rates. You've got some brands like Subaru and Lincoln and Ford in the 70s. So all that marketing that's not necessarily very well targeted is going to a very small audience. But the fact is, for any of you to grow, you have to keep what you've got and get more. And if at the beginning of every year you look at all the projections from all the OEMs, the industry should be running at about 35 million instead of 16. And yeah, so it is an issue. So let's just talk a little bit about conquesting and how you go out and, you know, because you've touched on something that really sort of doesn't get talked about as much as it should, because the easiest thing for you, theoretically, the easiest thing for you to do is to go out and get your current owners to repurchase. And it's the cheapest, according to all the marketing rules. But how do you go about conquesting? How do you identify who is the best and most likely suspect?
We go after Mini and Hyundai.
Yeah, everyone's a prospect until they buy or die when it's all said and done. But no, so who do you? It's true.
I got nothing to add.
No, but so, you know, for instance, Mini, you know, you've obviously got to grow. You've added models and you've got some new introductions here. They're not aimed necessarily just at the people who've been currently buying Mini. They're to expand your market. How do you identify where you're expanding, where you can expand and still keep your soul?
It's probably the question I get asked the most, frankly. But I think if we live in this somewhat rational space, and I think some automotive brands live more rational, some live more emotional. I think with Mini, if we look at our 8 out of our top 10 purchase reasons, they are very emotional, as it wouldn't surprise. So we look to other emotional brands. We'll look to Jeep, and you got to think, well, if I'm buying a Jeep Wrangler or a Gladiator versus a Mini, really, that's your competitive set? And yes, if you look at our defection and infection list, yes. I mean, it is these emotional brands. It is, again, Subaru will show up often on our competitive set. So again, you can't be narrow-minded in just looking at the old cross-shopped vehicle list. It is, again, look at what makes your brand. What are those, yes, qualitative old survey or focus group information that still have some value. Understand why people are purchasing your car and see what other brands may resonate that frankly wouldn't show up in a lot of other lists.
Right.
And then, of course, the challenge is how do you go after finding those audiences, which is extremely expensive as well as opposed to the loyalty play.
Okay. Eric, in your world,
I would just say we always try to find a balance. I wouldn't say that any one of our campaigns or models we have a pure conquest strategy as much as trying to find the right balance between speaking to and talking to in a compelling way our current owners, but then also we want to position ourselves as aspirational, and we want to position ourselves as a brand that's always looking beyond just our customer, but in a balanced way, because the cost can get extreme if all you're doing is pursuing conquest. And you know, reality sets in terms of just budgets and efficiency. Mm-hmm. And so it really just comes down to looking at the data, the cross shops, who the highest propensity to shop a Nissan is, and going after them, but in a balanced way, with also always looking towards opportunities and low-hanging fruit with current owners.
Okay, this is a question for all three of you.
Oh, I just want to add pepper or flavor to that and just say, for us internally, especially since we have Jose now. There's no balance. It's I want everything. I want it all right now.
You can get some tips from him.
Yeah, please. But I would say that for us, it's all about identifying also those people that are in market and looking at that data and figuring out if there's a compelling offer that we can put in front of them to at least just get them to take a look at our brand. And so then we do have a couple tools out there that we're using now like that, test drive incentives, et cetera. And they seem to be showing some returns. It's never enough, but it's a step in the right direction. And part of that is just data dependence. And we're going to continue to look at it and see what else it yields.
So this is a question for all three of you. What campaigns have you done that you're most proud of in terms of creating that of what is a real connection with your customers, and why? And then the opposite of that is, what have you done that you wish you hadn't done that you can talk about? So I'll start with you, Steve.
I have a real hate on the word campaign, to be honest with you, because I think it's somewhat...
It's whatever you define it.
Yeah, it's somewhat archaic, because I think traditionally as marketers we would launch a vehicle or launch in a band, or we'd peak and then valley. And I think the way customers consume content today, those peaks and valleys, and depending on your budget, your peaks can be very high, but then you can have a very deep and dark valley. For a sustained period of time, and that's no way to build.
And you've had them.
And we've experienced it. So I think it's that sustained, always-on approach to content serving. Again, I always talk about internally within the group. You know, if a piece of content or a campaign is performing well, as a marketer, why would you ever take it out of market? It's silly. Oh, well, because my media flight is up. Well, flight it again.
Actually, my experience as an agency is client wear out was a bigger problem than consumer wear out.
And it could be. I mean, if you are hitting reach and frequency where this is actually a burnout, okay, that's a problem. But with our budgets, I question whether or not, often we're hitting a reach and a frequency where we're actually burning. I think it's us, frankly, that gets more tired, or our dealer sets that get more tired of looking at the content. It's probably not the audience. And again, the information will tell us, the behavioral patterns will tell us if this is burning out, and if we were seeing great engagement and we're no longer seeing great engagement, okay, maybe time to change the messaging, or the audience has turned over or changed.
So what are you most proud of? Don't answer the question you wished I'd asked, answer the one I'd asked.
Yeah. I think most proud of understanding that, honestly, and I think understanding of how we serve and flight content going forward. And this is a recent phenomenon. I wouldn't say we understood this 5 years ago. So I think understanding this and understanding that will allow us to create better creative and more relevant creative. Without that understanding first, I mean, I don't care what we do, or we could have the best creative minds in the world in the room. So I think, not to skate the question, I think that's honestly what we're realizing our errors and realizing what we failed at is how we succeed. So I think that's where we're going.
I'll just say Nissan has been the premier partner of the Heisman Trust and the Heisman Trophy for 12, 13 years now. And I've had the privilege of at various levels of my career to be involved with that pretty closely throughout. And it's the one I'm probably most familiar with, but very proud of. I'm a huge fan, so it's kind of like I get to geek out every summer as we start developing the Heisman campaign. But,
can you bring a friend?
There you go. But Nissan's had tremendous success with that. Quite frankly, ESPN, our media partner with it, uses this partnership to try to sell other brands for other partnerships because they too are so proud of the way we work together and what we've been able to build with the Heisman Trophy and the Heisman Trust. It is a 360-degree campaign in every sense of the word, to the point where, as the premier partner of the Heisman, we actually get a Heisman vote. Nissan gets a vote, and we give it to fans. It's one of the 357 votes is actually given to the fans, courtesy of Nissan, and we get close to 1 million fans engaging with Nissan and the Heisman through that vote mechanism every year. That's just one piece of the way we go to market with it, and it's just something I'm very proud of. I also think all the campaigns we've done recently with Allison are brilliant. And no, I really, and I will say very seriously, what we've been able to do this past year by, again, bringing humanity in and bringing emotion into a tech message, what was a tech message 2 years ago, I'm very proud of, and we're having a lot of impact. And so between what we're doing for our models and then what we're doing for our brand with Heisman, it's been great.
What hasn't gone right?
There's so much.
Just pick one.
I'm not going to cop to anything in front of my boss. We'll just.
Okay, you're going to plead the fifth.
We'll have a drink later and we'll talk.
Okay, truth serum later. Eric?
I should have had enough time to think this through. I would say that we say internally that better drives us, and in kind of identifying this a few years back, it allowed us to sort of define a content series approach. That then we were able to apply to a bunch of different channels. So we produced the Rolling with the Rookie series as part of our sponsorship with the NFL and experienced tremendous success. And it was cool because it was telling, it allowed us to jump in as a fan of the sport and tell the story of athletes that were, going through the draft to become, a pick at some point. And everyone that we actually told the story of actually did get drafted, but to one team or another. And so that was neat because we were there authentically as a fan in this space and got to tell a story that normally wouldn't get told. And it was on brand for us to do so. And then we applied that same message last year to an LGBTQ content series that we produce. And it's exposed that this is our voice and this is how we endear ourselves to those parties that we support. And so we applied that. And then there was this other great story that we did through, you asked for just one, but it's this approach, right, that's on for us, that's working, and we told our Hope on Wheels story. So for every Hyundai that you buy, for the last 20 plus years, we donate towards finding a cure for childhood cancer. And we brought that story to life as part of our NFL Super Bowl ad a few years back. And it was neat because of, actually, I loved it because in all those cases, because everybody really enjoyed it, it brought a 360 approach internally. I think that's really good when everybody can get on board, and that's what made it fun. And they were positive messages and good for our brand, and so I think that's why and the what.
Yeah, no, a lot of we've been referencing here, the secret here is we're in a different era of marketing messaging because it isn't about messaging, it's creating conversations. And it is a 360, it just goes around and around and around, and if you can reach out to people and create that conversation, that's where you'll get the emotional connection. There's no question that works. It's just hard to keep yourself on the track.
We always say yelling versus telling within our roof, and yeah, it's very hard to yell or out-yell everybody, but it's nicer to have a conversation.
Yeah,
so.
exactly. You've all been very quiet there, so why don't we see if there's any questions out there in the audience. If not, I'll ask some of you. Is a threat?
Anybody? Oh, here's one.
There's also one down the front.
Sure. Hi, I'm Erik from GFK. My question is, there's a lot of amazing ideas and a lot of amazing things that you've all done in terms of getting that emotional connection, and to a certain extent, in a way, when you understand all the different audiences and all the different touch points and maybe even positioning, it struck on me, since there's such a long cycle, an ownership cycle, is there a way to actually now with one-on-one marketing to follow people around their journey, and have we done that good a job from an emotional viewpoint to follow Erik over the past decades and whatnot as he changed his, what he's looking for in a car?
I can speak to more. I mean, we look at our current customers. So, if they're keeping a car for 4 years, for example, on a lease, how do we keep that customer loyal without going back a decade? We look at a 3-year, and I'm telling this story because we are doing this here and now. We're very quick in our industry to throw $1,000 or $4,000 or a cash incentive or a lease incentive back to them. We're running a propensity algorithm to see, does the customer have a propensity to leave the brand based on their behavioral patterns over the 4 years with us? That could be online, that could be lifestyle, that could be after sales, that could be service. So we're able to cluster all that information into our DMP and understand that customer. So if they, and put a score to it, and if they have a high score, therefore have a high propensity to stay with the brand, then don't throw $1,000 or $2,000 or $5,000. Perhaps a bike rack that has a fraction of the value might go way, way further. Luggage rack, bicycle rack, or some other assessment or part assessment or accessory. So in doing so, this is again over the last year, we were able to kind of try to understand that over a 3-year period. To answer your question, I think, yes, it would be nice now to go back beyond 3 years and not just look at the current customers, but the win-back customers, the customers that we've lost, and understand them to the same extent. So step one, perhaps, in a further step process. Guys?
I would just say we believe there's opportunity in CRM, and it's just balancing focus, balancing message from those that are in the future market to near market to in market, both in CRM, but then, as I say, we balance that with conquest activity, and it just comes down to a matter of prioritization and where we want to put our focus and budget, quite frankly. And someone who just bought a car, we're certainly going to keep in touch with, but we may not be keeping in touch with them as frequently as we do if they're a year out or less. So it's just finding the right balance and cadence. But certainly we value our own owners and we stay in touch with them.
I would say that the challenge starts at dealer level. One, to be able to track that through, but also to initiate that post-sales relationship, starting from the point you sell that car to scheduling that first appointment, showing them how it can be done electronically, making sure dealerships follow up on that process to either ensure there's a car waiting or transporting someone to and from, making it so that it's easy for that person. But it starts literally the day you sign for that car and the relationship establishing there. When it's done right, then engaging with that person and tracking that through CRM all the way through is that much easier. But therein lies the challenge, right? So the dealer is everything in this process, and we continue to work through and work on that with them.
However, there is one thing that is changing, which we haven't touched on, which is connectivity, the connected car, and the opportunity that it does give OEMs that in the past, once that car's sold, they're out of luck, whereas you can interject and get yourself into that conversation in a meaningful way is an opportunity. But again, you're going to have to get dealer cooperation. That's always part of the trick. Sorry, next question. There was something in front of you.
I think we're ready to wrap. Thank you, gentlemen,
You want a bloody drink.
so much.
Thank you. Thanks.